All right, the next thing we're going to do to finish our collar is a takeoff, if you will, on the burrito seam that you used with your yoke. Again, we've got this extension out here. You have the option of sewing either with a quilting bar or with a using a different spot on your foot, or you can just simply trim the long seam to align with the shorter seam so that when you stitch this, you can use your 5/8 inch seam allowance. And so I'm just going to trim that edge off there so that it aligns. Be sure when you do that that you've pulled your shirt out of the way so that you do not accidentally trim your shirt. And notice it's only that curved edge that has to be trimmed. By the time you get to the top, they should match up top and bottom. They should be aligned. And so you'll trim both sides. Now remember, we pulled out the collar band facing a little bit further than we pulled out either the cuff or the collar. And there's a little bit of a variance, if you will, as to how far you're going to pull that out. If your fabric doesn't have a lot of give, you won't pull it quite as far. This fabric actually has quite a bit of ease, quite a bit of give in it. So I was able to pull it closer to that 3/16 of an inch. So if I trim that edge off, now my curves are the same size and I can actually just follow my 5/8 inch around. At this point, we need to do a little bit of pressing. We've got to make sure that the collar band facing and the collar band itself have a very firm line designed here close to the neck, and so I'm just going to press quickly right here at this edge. I'm going to press the collar band facing up. This also gives me a chance to check and see how well I trimmed that edge up, and did I really get them aligned? Do I need to trim it just one more time there and make sure that it aligns nicely? And you will do that on both sides. Okay. Now the burrito that we're going to make, we're going to fold up both the collar and the front of the shirt very neatly, very succinctly within the confines of that collar band that is sitting there. So I'm going to take my collar and basically fold it into thirds, if you will, and lay it down against the collar band facing. And I like to put a pin in there just so that it doesn't unfold or move itself as I did with the front of my shirt. Now I'm going to take the front of my shirt and do the same thing. I'm going to fold it back and fold it again. And usually if you will go into thirds or fourths, it will get small enough that you can do this. Some techniques will have you roll it. Rolling makes it a little bit more bulky, and so it makes it a little bit harder to do. You want to try to have this area here as flat as you can get it with all of this stuff folded up inside. Okay? So you can see it's fairly flat. The area that I'm going to stitch is this 5/8 inch curve up onto my collar, so I've got to be sure that there's nothing in that space that's going to get caught. And you stitch for about 1 inch onto the collar band. And so you've got to be certain that you have not overlapped there. And again, I quite often will stick a pin in there just to hold that thing in place. Then you fold the collar band facing up over all of that fabric that you have just folded up, just rolled up. Make sure that it lays smooth, and you are going to stitch this from the collar band side, or the side that is interfaced, because you can see, again, it's hard to see on, but there's the end mark where I sewed the collar, and I said be sure you stop so you can see where the stitching ended, and you can see where the stitching ended here, where you were stitching, where you stitched the collar band to your shirt. Those points become very important. So we're going to pin that together, and we're going to do that to both sides. All right, so they're both pinned. This is that edge of the collar, the front end of that collar band, with both my shirt and my collar fold it up very neatly and very compactly as much as I can inside of that area. And there is the end of my stitching where the collar band attached to my shirt, and here's the end of the stitching where the collar attached to the collar band. And what I'm going to do is literally start in that very spot, come up around this corner, and then sew 1 inch over the top of that space. Okay? Because it's a fairly tight curve, I'm going to lower my stitch length just a little bit, not to reinforcement, but just a little bit shorter than regulation stitching. And I drop that needle in. And all that shortening the stitch length is doing for me is making it so when this curve is pulled right side out, with the stitches being a little bit closer together, I will get a smoother curve. It won't tend to stop sign or have little poked edges that you can see in the curve because the stitch length was longer than it needed to be. You'll see if you come around that curve, you literally line right up with the stitching and you sew right on top of the stitching line. I'm sewing through the collar band, the interfacing, the collar that's rolled up inside of there, just the seam allowance. The rest of the collar is tucked down in here, and the collar band facing. And I only go just about 1 inch. I can't go any further, or I will be sewing on top of that collar that I rolled up to fit inside of there. And so you will do that on both sides. On one side, you'll start at the point and go up. On the other side, you will start actually on top of the seam allowance and head down around the curve, unless you want to sew on the opposite side and use on the opposite side of the presser foot and use the opposite side of the stitch plate. I do not want that to end undone. So I'm getting on top of my stitching here. I stay on the stitching, and now on this one I'm heading down the curve now. Until I exactly meet that spot, and then I backstitch to reinforce that corner.